Good evening and welcome to the Bangalore International Centre for our program this evening, Why Lalbagh Matters, Sultans Garden to Public Park. It is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Vijay Thiruvady, and our discussant, Arun Pai. Welcome. Among the accounts of our city, Vijay Thiruvady's recent book, published by the Bangalore Environment Trust, presents the most comprehensive history of Lalbagh written to date. Ranging across 5 centuries, it gives us an appreciation of what a wondrous place Lalbagh is. The book is based on documentation from Kew Gardens, the British Library, the India Office Records, the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh, and of course on Vijay's intimate knowledge of Lalbagh, having conducted nature walks for over 15 years that have been attended by over 15,000 walkers. He said it's probably more than that, but you can say 15,000. Many of you here, I'm sure, have been on them. And speaking for myself, I can say that his walks under the green canopy of Lalbagh have been a real source of solace and inspiration. This book joins his other notable books, one on the heritage trees of Bangalore, and one on Devrakadus and Gunduthoppus in and around Bangalore. He has spoken at BIC earlier on the trees of Bangalore with Girish Karnad and Captain Prabhala, and on Botanical Illustrations with Nirupa Rao. And we are very pleased to have him back. Our discussant, Arun Pai, is the founder of Bangalore Walks, which has conducted city walks on weekends for the past 15 years. Arun is a Bangalore lover and enjoys its stories and history. In 2005, he says he took a few people for a walk on MG Road and told them the city's story. And he's been doing it as a profession ever since. Vijay's lecture will be followed by a discussion with Arun, and they will then take questions from the audience. I should mention that this evening's event is in association with the Bangalore Literature Festival, which is being held at BIC this year on December 18th and 19th. Today's lecture is the first of what we are calling our open mic series, Raising the Curtain on the Festival. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Vijay Thiruvady.
Thank you, Pratiti. My book on Lalbagh was written just about a year ago, hurriedly, and because of the pandemic, we've not had a chance to give a presentation on it or talk about it. So I'm very, very grateful to BIC for giving me this opportunity. And I'm also overwhelmed with the number of people who've come here. Thank you. Now, I'm going to talk about many aspects of Lalbagh which are generally not known. I'm not going to list out all the achievements of all the superintendents and people who helped Lalbagh, but what I think are the key things will be presented. Anyway, there are time limitations, so I can't discuss everything. There is a great, great history to Lalbagh. Most of it is not known to the public. We generally hear about and read almost every week in some paper or the other, or journal, about the last 4 superintendents of Lalbagh, starting after 1870. But there's much, much more about Lalbagh, which I wish to talk about. The book is called Sultans Garden to Public Park. That is where the activity was concentrated in Lalbagh. But before that, much before that, Kempegowda built his tower in Lalbagh on the rock, and by the side, he had a little flower garden to provide flowers to the people, to the temples in his domain. This was continued. This was 1537. This was continued by his son, Magdi Kempegowda, right up to 1559. Then we don't have records of what happened since, but they must have continued with the flower garden, Huvinathopu. And we know that when the Wadayars took that area over in the 1730s, there were, the Lalbagh and the area around right up to the fort were given as a jagir to Haider Ali because he drove the Marathas out of Karnataka, out of Mysore then. And the Marathas had been raiding Mysore regularly and collecting tributes. They even partially destroyed Sringeri temple. So Haider Ali mounted an attack on the Maratha camps every night for 3 months and drove them out of Mysore. In recognition of that, the Wadayars gave him a jagir from Bangalore fort, the Peta included, and what is now Lalbagh, this whole area. So Haider Ali started a garden in present-day Lalbagh, which is almost exactly the same area where Kempegowda had his flower garden. Haider Ali's garden was based on the Charbagh Muslim Persian style gardens, and he got his plants from the four other famous gardens in India at that time: Lahore and Multan, Delhi, and Arcot. Arcot had a beautiful Charbagh. Now I go back to the earliest part of what we call Lalbagh today. To start with, Lalbagh is very, very special in many ways. Today we talk about the little walled-in area, which is a public park and a botanic garden. But we can go right back to Gondwana land, which broke up into 4 or 5 pieces, and one of them was the Indian tectonic plate, which moved northwards and finally collided with the Eurasian continent. There it is, collided with the Eurasian continent, created the Tibetan Highlands and the Himalayas, and the great river valley systems, the Indus, Brahmaputra, and the Ganges were formed after that. Down in the peninsula, halfway between both Bangalore and Madras, present-day Madras, they're right in the center of the plateau at 3,000 feet, Bangalore city was formed. Now, the formation of the of the peninsula and the rock which juts out in Lalbagh is quite spectacular. As the geologist, there was a Captain Newbold who was in the army, and he was also a great Orientalist. In the 1800s, he made a large number of trips in Peninsular India and studied the geology and the mineralogy of the whole area. He talks about netherworld rocks from the center of the earth, hypogene and trappean rocks, all of them under great pressure and temperature, all of them molten, and all of them going towards the surface of the earth. Before they hit the surface of the earth, they mix with the molten magma, finally break through, and then raft onto the lithosphere of the earth, and then stabilize 3 billion years ago. 3 billion years ago. 3,000 million years ago. And the Lalbagh rock, as we see today, is an outcrop of that, prodigious outburst, as Newbold mentions. Now, this rock is something which geologists from all over the world come to study even today, because it was originally called, granitic gneiss, even before that by Robert Bruce Foote, who was at the Mysore Geological Department. He called it Peninsular Gneiss. The last name which remains is gneiss complex. And it signifies a material which has undergone plutonic, volcanic, and sedimentary cycles, all telescoped into each other more than once, leading to deformation and metamorphism. And that is what we see in Lalbagh today. It's the finest place in the world to study the formation of the earth. As I said, this is 3 billion years old, and the Earth's age is 4.5 billion years old. So it's 3/4 of the age of the Earth, the rock you see in Lalbagh. We had a person who had come from Cape Town Observatory. He said, don't forget to mention, it's roughly 1/4 of the age of the universe, which was 12.5 billion years ago. the Big Bang. So we have a tremendous geological heritage here in Bangalore in the Lalbagh rock, which we don't realize and we don't bother about. We trample over it. Anyway, that is our geological heritage. Now, Lalbagh has three things. One is the rock, going back to 3,000 million years ago. Then there were megalithic burial chambers just found next to the rock. Now, this megalithic burial chamber, right within present-day Walden Lalbagh, goes back to 1.8 to about 3,000 years ago. And for some reason, and it has to be a stupid reason, the artifacts inside were taken out, potsherds and urns, and put in the government museum. They're no longer there. We don't know where it is. Then they actually flattened the site out, just next to the rock. I don't know why they did that. But anyway, it's no longer there. But early Iron Age man lived right within Lalbagh. Then after that, we know Lalbagh, actually, the Lalbagh I talk about is any area, any place within 10 kilometers radius of the rock. Now, at the Defense Airport in 1965, when they were expanding the aprons for larger aircraft to taxi in, they found hordes of Augustus Caesar and Tiberius's coins, which is extraordinary because it means that Lalbagh was probably passage between the east and west coast of India for trade. We know from Sir Mortimer Wheeler's excavations at Arikamedu, just 3 miles from Pondicherry, that the Yavanas, who were the bodyguards of the Tamil kings, lived there, and these coins were found there. He went into the quarters of the Yavanas. He also found arezzo ware, which are clay jars, which are filled with wine and brought all the way from Arezzo right into Pondicherry, Arikamedu, which means the Tamil kings lived very well because the Yavanas were the bodyguards of the Tamil kings and they were Romans. And these coins were found just 7 kilometers as the crow flies in Bangalore, and some have been found on the west coast. So I suspect that this Bangalore and Lalbagh would have been literally a passage for trade from the east to the west coast at that time, 50 years before Christ and 50 years after Christ. Now, these coins would not have been used as currency. No king would permit the currency of another ruler to be used in his kingdom. But they were so accurate, they were probably used as accurate measures for trade. Now, I've talked about these three things, the rock, the megalithic burial chambers, and the coins, which shows you the antiquity of Bangalore as well as Lalbagh itself. I haven't got anywhere near talking about the artifacts, the botany, and the rest. This is surely one of the most spectacular sites in the world, SITES. Now, the people who lived in Lalbagh, it would seem up to about 1600, were Jains and Hindus. They left behind artifacts, which we can see till today in Lalbagh itself. On the left, you have what is called a Veerakallu. That is commemorative stones, generally, 3 or 4 inches thick, were mined or they were quarried from a nearby rock. And bas-relief sculptures are made of the hero, commemorative stones actually commemorating the valor of the hero, whether he outlived the battle or not. In this particular case in Lalbagh, we have this next to the rock again, this wonderful bas-relief sculpture, which shows a warrior wielding a spear, which is obviously his preferred weapon of war. And on the left, you have 2 women celebrating with percussion instruments, which means that he outlived the battle. And these bas-relief sculptures are done with great subtlety. It seems quite rough as it is. But look at the way the spear is portrayed there. It is slightly bent, which gives it motion. It's as though it's about to leave his hand. So that I didn't know how to date it. Because right there, prominent, but I didn't have any dates. There's nothing on this bas-relief sculpture. So there's a gentleman from Indian Institute of Historical Study who said 1400 AD. So I said, how did he arrive at the magical date? He said, look at the headdress of the warrior and the hairstyle of the ladies who've got their hair piled up on the side. These were the prevalent styles during the Vijayanagar Empire, 1365 onwards, I think. And so he said, happily say 1400, nobody can contest it. So there you are. We say that in 1400, this sculpture was put up. You have another one or two of these in Lalbagh within the Walden compound even today. The other one's near the Joint Director's office. It's a beautiful sculpture showing a dead hero being assisted on his way by Apsaras to his heavenly kingdom Kailasa. Now on the right you have a Nishidi Stone. Many of them have been found around Lalbagh. This one is from near Begur, 7 kilometers from Lalbagh. Nishidi stones are stones which are actually, again, bas-relief sculptures, again 3 or 4 inch slabs. They're done by Jains. Jains fasted as often as they could. They were a pretty peaceful lot, and they spent a lot of their time in meditation and spiritual practices. And often, when they felt that they'd learnt enough and developed enough spiritually in the world into which they were born, they calmly fasted to death. And at that point, they achieved nirvana or mukti or moksha or spiritual liberation and wanted to get on with their practices into the next world. At the spot where the Jain died, they had these very ornate, beautiful bas-relief sculptures called Nishidi Stones. So that's a Nishidi stone there on the right, but this is not half as ornate as most of them. So these were the two communities who lived there. The Muslims came in afterwards. It was the Bahmani kingdoms controlled Lalbagh, the Bijapur sultans. Then the Mughals were there also for 3 years. They'd come in from Sira, where Dilawar Khan was, Nawab Dilawar Khan, he was there. Right. Now, after this, we get on to Haider Ali and Tipu Sultan. Haider is considered the real founder of Lalbagh. He was given this area, as I mentioned earlier, as a Jagir. Now, he struggled with the aridity of the land. And anyway, he set up 3 gardens. In 1759 or so, he fought the British, and he was Faujdar of the Maharaja of Mysore's army at Dindigul. And within a year, he controlled a territory which is twice the size of present-day Karnataka. Being a Muslim, to Muslims, a garden on earth is a reflection of paradise. So the design of a garden was very important, and the whole approach to the design was one of almost, a sacred act. And Haider Ali, as an act of piety and thanksgiving as a Muslim, to thank his maker, set up 3 gardens. One in present-day Lalbagh, in the territory given to him by the Wadiyars. Another one at Malavalli, which is halfway through from Bangalore to Talakadu, which was the capital of the Western Ganga kings. And the third one was at Srirangapatna itself. Now, Haider died in 1782 when his son Tipu Sultan took over. Tipu Sultan was an extraordinary man. He brought in plants from wherever in the world he'd heard of these plants, but particularly from French and Muslim territories, which he had great access to. So he got plants from East Africa, Madagascar, Mauritius, Persia, Turkey, Tenerife, Canary Islands, and oaks and pines. We're talking about 1782 around then. Oaks and pines from Cape Town, which was a great clearinghouse for plants worldwide. Tipu also got eucalyptus trees from Australia, which were planted in a summer palace in Nandi Hills. Now, this was an extraordinary thing because Australia itself as a country was formed in 1788. By 1793, Tipu had these eucalyptus trees in his summer palace. It's not clear how he got them, but Australia is the only place where you get eucalyptus trees from, except one species which is also available in the Philippines. And I don't know whom Tipu heard about this, but he wanted it in India and he got it. He may have got it from Pamplemousse Gardens, which is a great French botanic garden in Mauritius. Or he may have got it from a shipwreck of a Frenchman called Labiniere, who was carrying eucalyptus trees from Australia westwards. Either way, he got them, and it shows you the love he had for plants. They were not mere curiosities. He put them to work. He had a good feel for what would work in the terrain of Bangalore. For example, he got what we call chakota today, which is shaddock or pomelo, which is itself a hybrid of two citrus fruits which were growing in China and Thailand at that time. He had a sure feel for what would work. He brought the shaddock, planted it outside Devanali fort where he was born, and 200 years afterwards, he's got geographical indication tag for the chakota. That means you can't call any shaddock or pomelo chakota unless it's been grown on the slopes of Chikballapur. Just like cognac and champagne, if the grapes are grown in that region of France, then you can call them the brandy or champagne as being, from cognac or use the appellation cognac. And he did, it was with everything that he did, connected his plants seemed to work. He got silkworms from an island called Kisim, just off the coast of Oman. He got mulberry bushes from China through Bengal. He put them two together and created the greatest agro industry Karnataka has known, Mysore and Karnataka. He had over 350 centers for silk production. You can imagine the great things he did with plants. It was not just merely that he grew poppies on the slopes of coming down from Nandi Hills towards Devanali and earned regular revenue from the opium which was sold. Then there are so many other things which Tipu did, connected with plants, like an extraordinary use of plants was creeper, which has formidable thorns called Cessapellinia separia. And he used them, grew them all along his forts on the walls. And so if an enemy had crossed the moat, he still had to cross this, which was almost impossible to do. And so it goes on, it's endless. And when I talked about eucalyptus, it was not just a stray thing. Almost everything Tipu touched turned into so many other things later in the subsequent years. Today, those same eucalyptus trees are used for, eucalyptus pulp is used for newsprint. It is also used for making eucalyptus pulp first, then rayon grade pulp, and then it's converted into rayon cords for tires, which is done in Harrier Polyfibers in Karnataka. And he's hardly been acknowledged. He did more in a sense than the botanists at that time did. At that time that Tipu was there were three great plant collecting expeditions mounted out of London, one by the Royal Society, one by the Royal Horticulture Society, and one by 12 of Linnaeus' students called the Apostles. They went everywhere in the world, and they collected plants often at the cost of their own lives and funneled all these plants into Kew Gardens just outside London. When Tipu died, the British kept Lalbagh to themselves, and all the plants in Kew Gardens was available for being planted in Lalbagh and any other place in India. So that was the kind of change after Tipu which took place. And Lord Robert Clive's son, Edward Clive, who was governor of Madras from 1898 to 1904, or rather 1798 to 1804, he recommended to Benjamin Heyne, who was a German missionary at Tarangabadu, Tranquebar on the east coast of India, to appropriate Lalbagh Gardens. Now, Haynes has a botanical pedigree to him. One of Linnaeus's students, called Koenig, he was a private student of Linnaeus. He had found his way to Tranquebar. Tranquebar was a Danish Norwegian territory which they happily gave up to the British because they couldn't find much use for it. This is an image of photograph of Dansborg, a formidable fort on the seaside, which was built by the Danes. And Tranquebar grew around the fort. Now, the Lutheran Mission and the Hall Mission from out of Germany, they settled down in Tranquebar, and they were basically missionaries there. They picked up the language of the local people, studied the religion, the caste systems, the palm leaf manuscripts which talked about the herbs growing in that region. And all of them in their spare time, strangely enough, they were interested in plants and started collecting all the plants around Tranquebar. They formed a society called the United Brotherhood. And they got all these plants together. They didn't know enough about botany, but they sent them all off to Europe to start herbariums and to have them all fully identified. So you had Koenig, who was a student of Linnaeus, coming to Tranquebar. Koenig was a very, very bright person, and he was not satisfied with the little work he did around Tranquebar. He joined the Nawab of Arcot and very soon joined the East India Company. And he actually trained William Loxberg, who's often called the father of Indian botany, who passed on everything he knew of modern botany, which Koenig had picked up from Linnaeus, and passed it all on to Benjamin Heyne, who took over the Samalkot Gardens from Roxburgh in 1775, when Roxburgh went to Calcutta as the head of the Royal Botanic Gardens. Now, Benjamin Heyne was an extraordinary man. He spent a little while in Tranquebar, wanted to go back to Germany, didn't find it conducive. And there were a whole lot of other very well-known botanists in the United Brotherhood, and Tranquebar wanted to save him to do botanical work in India, so he was asked to take over Samalkot Gardens. He left Samalkot Gardens in 1799 when the British decided to close it down because it's just about 14 miles from present-day Kakinada, Samalkot, because they found it was very similar in climate to Royal Botanic Gardens in Calcutta, and it was repetitive work which was being done. It was a hot and humid climate. So they sent him to Bangalore, where he was part of Mackenzie's route survey in 1800. He held, he had two hats, one for the survey, and then he was asked to actually appropriate Lalbagh Garden. Now, Haynes is one of the extraordinary men who, he was the first European superintendent of Lalbagh, came in 1800, took over Lalbagh properly in 1802, left in 1807 before his full tenure, which went up to 1812. Now, Hayne introduced modern botany and definitely modern taxonomy straight into Lalbagh, among the first places in India. And he did 100 other things. He wrote a book on the 394 plants on the Coromandel Coast, and a host of other things. Perhaps we'll talk about him a little later. But he was asked to grow potatoes and succulent vegetables in Lalbagh for the European palate, European soldier's palate, if you please. So he grew the potato. He got the original stock from St. Helena, west of Africa, and he grew it on the slopes of Nandi Hill and Savanadurg. These were the first potato plantations in India. Heyne did this effortlessly. And when he went to check on the growth of the potato plantation in Savanadurg, to his astonishment, he writes that the natives had eaten it all up before I could see what had happened there. And he goes on to mention that the natives were very clever commercially, that they took the potatoes from both these plantations and they themselves marketed it across India to all the Englishmen who wanted it. This was the first potato plantation in India, but you can see what is generated out of Lalbagh. Most people are not aware that what Heyne started in 1800 has led to India becoming the second largest potato producer in the world today. The second potato plantation was at Lander, where Ruskin Bond stays, in 1828. That is uphill from Missouri. So there are many, many things which Heyne did out of Lalbagh. Like he was a hands-on man, refused to sit behind a desk in Lalbagh. He went to Coimbatore and the Western Ghats, collected over 300 plants never seen by anybody else or people outside the region where they grew. And he passed 200 of the plants still have the name which he gave them. Taxonomy, as you know, is half of botany. Anyway, he planned to send all these plants to Dr. Willdenow, who was Alexander von Humboldt's botanical mentor. In the event, Willdenow died. Heyne sent it to another friend called Dr. Roth in Germany, who wrote one of the first floras of India based on the specimens that Heyne sent out of Lalbagh to Germany. Now, these are the things I'm emphasizing. That's the cover page of Dr. Roth's book. You can see Heyne's his name very clearly, Benjamin Heyne, based on the specimens of Benjamin Heyne. So he did so many more things. Maybe we can talk about a little later. So that was Benjamin Heyne, a very restless, brilliant Teuton who did things very, very thoroughly, and the mark still remains through the books. He wrote a classic book called Tractus. Anyway, I'll move on. The next person was, when Heyne left, there was nobody to look after Lalbagh, and the British government then decided that Lalbagh was not important, Bangalore was not important. They were going to set up a botanical garden in Saharanpur, which was called Farhat Baksh Garden, set up by a Rohilla chief. They thought that was a better place for a botanical garden, which of course was not mentioned to anybody in Bangalore. So they suggested that the garden be looked after by anybody who has some knowledge of botany and of plants, and he could sustain it by selling the produce. So we had an army paymaster called Gilbert Waugh coming in from Masulipattnam. He got married to Charlotte Wahab in Masulipattnam in 1807, came straight to Lalbagh, and he was there in Lalbagh for 11 years. We don't have too many details about what he contributed. We know that he brought in a lot of fruiting trees from China and from Europe. And he had some knowledge previously of growing sugarcane and coffee in the Mysore region. And then he was transferred in 1819 to Vallalabad, and then he was straight on to Coorg, and he was involved in the annexation of Coorg. But I think his greatest contribution, not to Lalbagh but to India itself, was his son, Andrew Scott Waugh, who was the third Surveyor General of India after Everest. Lambton was the first one, who was in Bangalore for some time. Then you had Everest, and it was actually Andrew Scott Waugh, together with Sigdor, who together declared Mount 15 as the tallest mountain in the world, which is now, and they named it after Everest, who had never seen the mountain. But this is all part of the great trigonometrical survey of India. General William Munro, I consider him the greatest, one of the greatest, he with Cleghorn, who were in Bangalore in the early years. He came to Bangalore at the age of 22, or maybe a little earlier. He was an army man, had no training in botany. He spent only 4 years in Lalbagh. He started the Agro Horticulture Society, which was actually affiliated to the same society started by William Carey in Calcutta. And Munro was the secretary. Munro first went out to Coorg and Nilgiris and recorded the plants there through Botanical Illustrations. He discovered 2 new species of roses in Coorg, which have never been found since. He wrote the first flora of Bangalore, Hortus bangalorensis, when he was in Bangalore, and that the original volume is in Kew Gardens. And it must be, you must know this, that for over 100 years after that, nobody has written about the flora of Bangalore. And William Munro did it effortlessly. Higginbotham's published a volume in 1908, but I couldn't find a copy. I would have loved to see that copy of Munro's Flora Bangalorensis, as he called it. Then he did many, many other things. He discovered at Kamptee in North Karnataka a fossil of Glossopteris. Now, Glossopteris is one of the fossils. It's referred to as a Permian seed fern, which is one of the proofs of the theory of continental drift. Almost everything Munro seemed to do was of very great importance. He started a study of grasses and graminae, which includes bamboos, in Bangalore, and very soon he became the world's greatest authorities on grasses and also on bamboos. Lots of plants have been named after him. He went to Agra from here through North Karnataka, and he started the Agra Botanical Gardens. And, well, I'll get on to the next thing. Lots of plants, one of them is mentioned here, Munronia pinnata. We'll probably, if we have time, talk about Munro. But he was just here for 4 years, and he did earth-shaking things in terms of the impact on the west of the work he had done in Lalbagh. It wasn't a one-way traffic. Right. Dr. Cleghorn, he's my hero. He's hardly heard of in Bangalore today. He spent 20 years in India. He came into Bangalore after spending 3 years in Madras, where he was a surgeon trained in St. Andrews and in Edinburgh. Now he's an extraordinary man. He's called the Madras Polymath. He did innumerable things, and all of them which are still to be admired, definitive works. He was posted in Shimoga in 1845. And his job in Shimoga was he was considered the chief vaccinator, which makes is of interest considering we're talking about vaccination in India today with the pandemic. He was the chief vaccinator operating out of Shimoga. He was also in charge of the hospital. He was the magistrate there, and every morning he'd go to the jail. But in his spare time, note down, in his spare time, he did trips out of Shimoga into the Malnad and Maidan regions. He got hold of a Maratha artist whose name was not revealed, and he made 450 drawings, which have recently been discovered in the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh. I'll talk about that when we get to the section on botanical gardens. But he did many, many other things. This shows a map of Shimoga right in the center, and the trips which Dr. Cleghorn took. Now, Cleghorn didn't even mention that he had made these trips. From the annotations on each one of the drawings, Mr. Nolte of Royal Botanic Gardens was able to make out the date of the visit and the place which he had visited. And put together, he managed to make this map out of his journeys out of Shimoga, which was all unofficial activity. And this artist he got hold of, whose name is not revealed, he was of the Gudigar class. They are traditionally from Sorab and in that area, Bidanur, where they were sandalwood carvers and often painted in temples also. This Maratha's artist made 450 brilliant, drawings of botanical illustrations, which I'll show you later. But this was the kind of work done by Cleghorn, and his family donated 3,000 drawings to the Royal Botanic Garden, which were not seen till 10, 15 years ago. And I got the first books, and I'm in correspondence with Dr. Nolte to find out all this, and very kindly gave me all this material. Yes, now Cleghorn was also represented India at the great, the great international exhibition held at Hyde Park in 1851. And there, the building which housed the great international exhibition was the Crystal Palace. Now, when Cleghorn attended that, it was a huge section given for India, and the raw produce, the manufactures, the paintings, hundreds of things were exhibited in the Indian section, including the Kohinoor diamond. The Great International Exhibition was a defining point in the 18th century, in 1851, because there were 6 million visitors. At that time, that's a lot of visitors in England within a 6-month period. And Cleghorn enjoyed being there, but it had a tremendous impact on him and on India. In fact, the impact on Sir Jamshed Jejeebhoy was such that he started, based on what is seen in the exhibition, he started what is called the Bombay School of Arts and Industry, which later became the JJ School of Arts, among which there's some students here. And the first head of the JJ School of Arts was Rudyard Kipling's father, Lockwood Kipling. And the JJ School of Art started by him has molded, Indian art for decades afterwards. But the Crystal Palace is of importance to us in Lalbagh because that was the model on which the Lalbagh glass house was made. It's a miniature of the Crystal Palace, which is 3 stories high, completely a structure made out of glass, and all of the weight of glass transmitted through hollow, narrow, slender columns to the ground. Now, Cleghorn was so inspired by what he saw at the exhibition, he came back to Madras and held 2 exhibitions. They were very, very famous in their time, in 1855 and 1857. I talk about all this because that was Madras Presidency head that included all of Mysore, right from the west coast to Orissa, actually. And these exhibitions, they were so important, and Lord Harris was the governor then. He thought it was so important that they actually declared a holiday on the day of the exhibition to let the citizens know. They fired 6 cannons, from the battery at Fort St. George in Madras. That's the picture you see, the firing of the cannons, announcing this exhibition, which was a very, very great success of all the produce in South India. And Cleghorn exhibited 28 different resins, 45 different kinds of woods, different dyes from plants and resins, a whole lot of things, including botanical illustrations. And this is all generated by Cleghorn, who was 2 years directly in charge of Lalbagh. And he moved in and out, and he was later made the first conservator of forests in India in 1857. Yes. Now, when Cleghorn came in, already after 4 years, you had Colonel Munro moving out in 1840. 1842, the Agri-Horticulture Society wound up. Cleghorn came in 1856, and there was nothing there in Lalbagh. Everything Munro had grown had practically disappeared. So Cleghorn felt this is not the way to go about things. He wanted professionalism in Lalbagh. So he talked to Sir William Hooker in Kew Gardens, and they decided to lay out the aims and objectives of Lalbagh, both for the Botanic Garden and horticulture. as well as they decided that they would get professional botanists from Kew to come and man Lalbagh. And so you had from 1858, when William New came in, right up to Marigada's tenure in 1973. Over a century, 6 gardeners who had been trained in Kew, which included Mr. Cheluvaiah as well as Marigada. There were 3 Englishmen, and there was, of course, Mr. Krumbagel. Now, William New came in 18... Okay, we'll move on to Black. Now, William New came in newly. He was very excited with what he saw in 1858. He landscaped Lalbagh. He built that bund, planted trees on the slope of the bund, which he created specially to plant trees there. He, within 2 years, in 1861, he listed out all the plants in Lalbagh, which was 1,100 and something, which was sent to Edinburgh. At that time, the focus was still, because of Cleghorn, in Scotland. Later, it moved to Kew Gardens. And he did numerous things with Lalbagh, but he pioneered them. And the listing of the plants is very important because within 2 years, he had already cultivated these plants, which are great successes in Lalbagh. Then he did a lot of other things for irrigation, so on and so forth, within Lalbagh. Now I'm going to talk less about the people who come in who helmed Lalbagh because they're quite well known. Adam Black came in from, at the recommendation of Sir William Hooker, to Lalbagh. He was in ill health, and they thought coming to Lalbagh, his health would improve. He was a curious man. Lalbagh at that time ended very close to the glass house. And the rock in Lalbagh was outside Lalbagh at that time. So he saw the rock there, and he saw how it was terraced. And he noticed how the natives, as he puts it, uniquely quarried the rock. When they wanted a circular slab of rock, they marked it out, created a channel round the circle, which was about 4 feet deep, 4 inches deep and about 4-5 inches wide. They hammered in metal pegs at the bottom, iron pegs, and put in logs, wooden logs and eucalyptus leaves on top and set the top on fire. And after some time, the top expanded, the bottom cracked exactly where the pegs were driven in, and they, lifted the rock piece, actually prized it out first with crowbars, and then they lifted and took it away. Now, there are 2-3 things which Black was impressed with, and which we should be impressed with today. We don't even notice it in Lalbagh. The first was that everything was done noiselessly. They never took out more rock than they required, and they did it silently. And later, if they needed more rock, they took out another circular piece. And as Baijus will tell you, a circle contains the greatest square area within any of the figures. So he was so impressed, he sent a sketch in a letter to Sir William Hooker in Kew Gardens, showing exactly how the rock was actually, the terracing was created by all the circular slabs being removed. He shows on top parent rock, he's written, on the left also parent rock. In between, he shows, I can't quite read it, but fire. Yes, he's put in there fire. And at the bottom again, parent rock. And then he shows the thickness of the rock and the wedges very clearly there in dark black. He was so impressed. Of course, much later this land was acquired. But if you ever go to Lalbagh, you'll see this lovely terracing. It was done because of the quarrying, and it's all circular slabs. Now, of course, it looks lovely. But when they discovered the antiquity of the rock, they stopped the quarrying, But what is to be emphasized is 150, 70 years ago when this quarrying was done, the people who lived around Lalbagh, and I suppose everywhere else, had great regard for nature. And they didn't do what we do today. I mean, we get a, Kirloskar pneumatic drill a hole, get a, dynamite stick, put it in and blow up the whole hillside and take pieces of granite out. As you can see all the way to the airport on the left. They had so much reverence that they didn't, take out more than what they needed, and they did it noiselessly and silently. Next. Okay, the Lalbagh, the glass house is actually based on the Crystal Palace, which was based on a plant structure, which was the, Victoria Regia, later called Victoria Amazonica. And this shows you a photograph of how a Victoria Regia can take the weight of a standing person on it without anything happening to the lily pad, which is turned up at the end. So when the competition for the building which would house this was done, the head gardener of the Duke of Devonshire, Paxton, put in his design 2 weeks after the last date. And he designed it on the Victoria Regia, which he found is capable of taking a great deal of weight. And that is because the underside has radial ribs and cross ribs like in a spider's web, but all of it has entrained air in it. So it is buoyant of its own accord. And I've seen there you can see it, all the ribs and pockets of air. And he found that a great deal of weight can be carried down through a narrow, slender stem of the Victoria Regia to the ground. So he replicated this in his design of the Crystal Palace. All that great weight of glass comes down to the ground through narrow, slender columns, and this is a copy of it. You can see the slender columns coming down to the ground. Glass is a naturally very, very heavy substance. And this is a replica, the only one remaining now, because the original Crystal Palace burnt up in 2 major fires in Sydenham Hill, where it was taken to later. Next. Yes, this is now just, I'm talking about the structures within Lalbagh. That was the original Kempegowda tower on the left. And on the right, you've got the same tower, which has been worked on. The pillars are the same, and it has been converted into something like a Hindu mandapa. But it's not true to history. That is a painting, I think, of, I'm not quite sure, maybe Martin or any of the 4 or 5 painters who made paintings from the rock of the gardens below, which are just next to the rock. But it shows you the change, but that is embedded. The original structure is embedded in the new tower, which was changed in in Kengal Hanumanthayya's time. Then this, of course, the famous Cheluvaiah Hall. It was actually constructed in 1860s. And this is where Cheluvaiah used to spend most of his time. It's a small hall, exquisite architecture. It also held a herbarium which had disappeared, but it was done in that hall. It was a lecture hall for young horticulturalists. Next. Botanical Illustrations. I'll stop at the Botanical Illustrations. Yes, in erstwhile Mysore state, you had 3 centers for Botanical Illustrations. The biggest was Lalbagh itself, and then in Shimoga, and then the Basil Mission in Bangalore. Now, right, you can get to the next. Just to give you a little background, these are 2 woodcuts from Da Costa's work, who was a Portuguese who lived in Goa, and he wrote the first account of Materia Medica in India. And they are woodcuts actually, but you can identify the plant. You have pepper on the right and you have jackfruit on the left. Next. Then you have this marvelous work, 12 volumes, magisterial, brought out by Van Reed, who was the governor of Cochin. And this is in 12 volumes, superbly illustrated, probably the finest illustrations botanically anywhere in the world at any time. These two are insets from volume 3 of what is called Hortus Malabaricum, and the Botanical Illustrations are, as I said, an inset, and the names of the Dutch artists who made them were Bastian Stopendale and another Dutch artist called Gootkind, Anthony Gootkind, because they've signed it. Each and every one of the illustrations of the plants there is from the Western Ghats, about 792 of them, and each one superbly illustrated, and each one has the name of the plant in Arabic, in Sanskrit, in Latin, and sometimes in Dutch, and of course in Malayalam, as you can see on the top left of the right painting. Next. Well, this is Basil Mission. They used another technique of nature self-print, and there was Reverend Hunziger and Father Metz, who around the Basil Mission, they collected plants, and they actually put ink and put any form of pressure on the ink and on the lithograph or even paper. They got these images. The thing about these nature self-print is dimensionally they are correct, and there is a softness and of almost velvety finish to each one of the illustrations, and the venation of the plants comes out very, very clearly. And this was the first exposure in Europe to all the plants around Bangalore. Next. Then, of course, Cleghorn's paintings. What I've done here to save time is to compare Cheluvaiah Raju's paintings, which tragically I noticed this year there's been a book brought out from Kew Gardens. The author is Martin Rix, and it's Martin Rix is the editor of Curtis magazine, which is part of Kew now. And in England, you have over 28,000 botanical illustrations from India. And they've talked about every other artist in India except Cheluvaiah Raju was in Lalbagh for 10 years. And they have a lot of his paintings which have gone from Bangalore in Cameron's reports, annual reports, to Kew Gardens. This is the extent they have neglected, the world has neglected the work done out of Bangalore, and so have we. Even we are not aware of this. Now, there was a complaint in Kew Gardens that Indian painters are very stiff, in their paintings. All their paintings are very stiff, and, it's not flexible. So Nolte, in a special lecture on Robert White in the Linneal Society, actually projected this. It's a painting by Rangaya. It is of a Kurkubit. He says, look at the painting. Rangaya started with the stem on the right-hand corner, bottom corner, and he's taken the stem for a walk, if not a dance. Puts it very well. This was a prejudice against Indian painters because it's not so. Look at the flexibility, the ebullience, the sinuousness of the whole painting, Right. Now I'm taking a painting of Cheluvaiah Raju, comparing it with other painters of both having painted the same plant. We have what is called here, painting on the left is by Cheluvaiah Raju, the one on the right by Govindoo, which Kew Gardens and everybody else knows very well. Now, this is of a plant called Castorospermum austral. It was found where the Brisbane rivers empties out into the sea, and what's called Moreton Bay. In fact, it's called the Moreton Bay bean plant also. And look at the difference between the paintings of the same plant by two different artists, Govindoo on the right and Cheluvaiah Raju from Lalbagh on the left. These plants were very soon planted, and you have an avenue of it from Maharaja's statue to Siddhalingaya's circle today, the whole way through. Unfortunately, it's been beautifully covered with diesel dust. So you can't see the flowers in pristine beauty like these. But look at how beautiful the flowers are and how beautifully these paintings have been executed. Next. Now, on the right is a painting of a mango by Cheluvaiah Raju. Look at the different way these botanical illustrations are painted. They're all botanically and scientifically accurate. Dimensions, proportions, the colors, all of it. The one on the right is done by Cheluvaiah Raju so beautifully that he's cut the mango and you can almost feel the juices flowing out of it. On the left is a thing which you constantly see with mango trees. They're beautiful magenta colored new leaves. So beautifully portrayed here. Next. Yes, this is called Kigelia pinnata. You have a stand of them in Lalbagh. You have it in different places in Bangalore. It comes from Africa. The one on the left is by Govindoo. The one on the right is by Cheluvaiah Raju. Look how it's superbly done, but differently. Now, it's also called the sausage plant, and Cheluvaiah Raju has painted the sausage. It goes like that at the right bottom. Cheluvaiah Raju here, I think what he's portrayed is certainly superior to Govindoo's paintings, which are very well known in Europe and America today. Next this is the painting of our simple Karela, or Mormodica Charanta, as it's called in Latin. The left one is by Govindoo, the right one is by Cheluvaiah Raju. I wouldn't dare attempt to paint this. Look at how the texture of the bitter gourd comes out, so beautifully done. Even the pen sketch on the left bottom and left top by Cheluvaiah Raju. Superbly done, sinuous, the flowers are there, the leaves are very clear, and the texture of the bitter gold. Next. Yes, the one on the left is called Calotropis. This is, it's commonly called the milkweed. You find it all over the countryside in India. This was painted by Govindoo. These were the last two, by the Maratha artist of Cleghorn. These were the last two paintings done by him, I think, for Cleghorn. The left painting shows the flowers and the leaves. These flowers are so beautiful. They are used as garlands for Lord Ganesha in Benares in all the temples. Garlands are made out of this. And Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii, she made jewelry replicating these flowers, and enamel work, very beautifully done. And on the right, you have the famous Indian datura, which is deadly poisonous. It's a beautiful plant, and I've got 5 daturas painted and shown in different ways so that you can see what you can do with botanical illustrations. This is Nature Self-Imprint by Cleghorn himself of the datura. It's also called Brugmansia. It's got a number of names. And look at the velvety finish, a rich softness using this technique. Look at the venation of the leaves, comes out very clearly. The left is, I think, by Marianne North, who was a famous painter. It's an oil, painting. And this is of what was called Brugmansia. It was found in Chile. Bartram, plant collector, bought it and brought it to America, sent it to Kew Gardens, now it's come to India. And you have this growing beautifully in Lalbagh and in the 3rd block park in Koramangala. And you've got the same Brugmansia, or datura, which has been Datura stramonium, which is shown in Hortus malabaricum. It's a copper plate, hand painted later. So you've seen 4 different ways of handling datura, whatever name you give it, Brugmansia or otherwise, all done differently. Copper plates, hand painted, oil paints, nature's self-print, and what Cheluvaiah Raju has done. This one is my favorite painting out of Cleghorn's collection. It's of the wild ginger. It was made when they saw this plant. Science did not know of this plant, but it was painted anyway by the Maratha artist. It was painted at a place called Hulial, very close to Dharwad. They didn't know the plant, but he painted it nonetheless, and it's part of the Cleghorn collection in Edinburgh. Then in 1993, 3 taxonomists Vilayuddin, Amal Raj, and a third one, Muralidharan, found this 50 miles away in a tea garden where it's growing endemically, and it was established that this is the wild ginger, and they gave it a name, a scientific name. For the first time, it's called Curcuma karnatakacensis today. This is again, now I'm only talking about Cheluvaiah Raju, 3-4 of his illustrations. This is a beautiful one of the Chakota or the Shadok. Look at the painting, the restricted frame. You can see even the pores on the Chakota. Then you have the citrus leaves and the beautiful flowers. Next. This is a painting of what is called Ficus krishnae, a fascinating plant. This has been done by Cheluvaiah Raju and very, very accurately. Next. Yes, there was a time that a red and russet dye was produced from a plant called Opuntia, on which the cochineal insect fed. And the exudations from the cochineal insect led to a carmine dye. These were imported, these plants were imported, it's now commonly called the prickly pear. They were imported from Mexico and first grown in Madras and then came to Lalbagh. And Cheluvaiah Raju painted this. The flowers, the thorns, the buds, all of it. Very beautifully painted. And this is what, the days before the big German companies had synthetic paints, this was the paint which came carmine dye, which came from this plant, which was used for red and russet colors for woolens, as well as cotton, indigo, and others. Cameron. Now, one thing I want to mention here, and people don't understand this or never take it into account. Cameron spent something like 32 years in Lalbagh. Kempegowda spent 24 plus 24 years, 48 years in Bangalore. 24 as head of the government garden section. Then he was director of agriculture. So these people had a lot of time. Then, of course, Kempegowda spent 22 years. Javaraya spent the least amount, and therefore all his potential couldn't be realized because he was there in charge. I mean, so were the others. But Javaraya headed Lalbagh and the government garden section, and from something like 1932, 32 to 1944, out of which 5 years was taken out on deputation to Delhi, where he started the flower shows and agricultural marketing. So he totally spent only about 7 years in Lalbagh. So one couldn't expect too much impact from the work he had done, because what potential there was tremendous, considering how he trained himself and what he had done in Delhi. He did a number of things, and he was quite an extraordinary man, very polished, straddled the Eastern and Western world. And it is a pity that he died young when he was, the advisor to the Nawab of Bhopal on horticulture. So, but apart from that, Cameron spent, as I said, 32 years, 1874 to 1908. Kempegowda from 1908 to 1932, plus another 24 years till he died in Bangalore. So the quantum of work done by these three spread over a large period of time. They were all productive, but they didn't have the fire, the pioneering spirit of the others who helmed Lalbagh for the first 50 years. And largely because they were told what to do and they followed it. They were all productive in their own way, Next. Yeah, well, Cameron was famous for, he did a number of things. He did the greatest amount of work on coffee. He went to Kadur. He talked with all the planters. He developed 4 or 5 different strains of coffee, Nalaknad coffee, then Arabica, Robusta, all of them, and, hybrids. He did a lot of work in different fields on rubber, on cotton, so on and so forth. Kempegowda similarly was a very versatile man. He was trained for landscape, design, plus various other things to do with plants. But above all, He spread out, made buildings. He was called a bioaesthete, which was a special name given to just a few people in India who actually beautified the surroundings of a area very, very effectively through their planting. This is Indian Institute of Science, which is scrubland, which is time. Anyway, Kempegowda set up a whole lot of gardens, some with Dr. Narodi, right up to Jubilee Park and Jamshedpur. This is Krishnaraja Sagar designed by Kempegowda. Next, this was the BBMP building, the original blueprint. It doesn't have the square towers on it. Next. There's a little museum building made by Kempegowda within Lalbagh itself. And behind that is his favorite tree, flowering, that is Spatodia campanulata. Next. Mr. Chalovaya, as I've already mentioned, the different things he did. Chalovaya, when he was in charge of Lalbagh, you had this beautiful interior with the fountain there, which is all gone now, and that lovely trellis work, which let in enough light, but didn't make the whole area inside was very cool. This is the glass house, right? Yes, this was the big thing, which took out 5 years out of Lalbagh for Mr. Chalovaya. He was transferred to Delhi, where he started the flower shows, based on the flower shows in Lalbagh. And it was so successful that the Delhi flower shows have been compared to the Chelsea flower shows. And this is a photograph from a newspaper of the first flower show in Delhi in March 1934, where the Viceroy of India, Lady Linlithgow, she inaugurated it, and Mr. Chalovaya is to her right, showing her around. Next. Now, I think the greatest achievement of Chalovaya was when he was transferred to Delhi. This is hardly talked about, people don't know about it. He was asked to head what is called the Agricultural Marketing Division of the Imperial Council of Agricultural Research. Now, this was a stupendous undertaking. All the fruits and vegetables and agricultural produce were to be identified across the face of India, from Burma to Balochistan, from Kanyakumari up to Kashmir. And then they were to be marketed across India first. And Chalovaya spent some years involved in that, and he headed that. And this is a beautiful photograph because it shows you Chalovaya in many moods, immaculately dressed as he always is, sitting on the ground, checking apples, in Kashmir before they're packed and dispatched. Now, if today we get Kashmiri and Himachal Pradesh apples in Bangalore within 2 days of their dispatch, it is because of what Chalovaya started, identifying what is produced where and how to transport it across the country. Of course, he spent very little time there to see it all grow up, but I can mention this very clearly and categorically about Mr. Chalovaya. He spent very little time in Lalbagh, but he was still a very great institution builder. He started the Indian Institute of Fruit at Hesaragata, Mandya Orchards, a whole lot of institutions, but he didn't live to see them all thrive as today. Next, Maregowda took everything which was done for 100 years out of Lalbagh to the rest of Karnataka, and he was the last of the Kew gardeners. He spent over a year in Kew. This is how he approached it. Maregowda introduced a lot of things for farming, dryland farming, seed culture, seed protection, soil testing equipment, a tremendous number of things. The nice photograph of Maregowda with Dharmaveera, the governor of Karnataka, almost on their knees, looking over grapes in a vineyard. This is my book cover. That is a photograph of the statue of Chamarajendra Wadeyar, the 10th, made by sculptor. It was a bronze sculpture made by Onslow Ford, who made it. Was in Curzon Park in Mysore. Kempegowda brought it to Lalbagh and put it there. It is, I think, symbolic of the movement of power and the center of power from Mysore to Bangalore. And Ford made only one other sculpture in India, that is of the Raja of Darbhanga in Dalhousie Square in Calcutta.
Much for that broad, expansive, sweeping history of Lalbagh, from the geological treasures, its natural history, botanical illustrations, all the way to the 20th century and the colorful personalities that contributed to what it is today. I'd like to invite Arun Pai on stage at this point to moderate the discussion and to take a few audience questions if there's time.
There was pin drop silence for 1 hour 20 minutes. He didn't have a sip of water. How many of you have been on a walk with Vijay in Lalbagh? Could you please raise your hands? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. I've been working with him for 15 years and I hate to tell him to stop talking. And today I had that terrible job of giving him a hint that you have to stop in 40 minutes and then you spoke Vijay for 1 hour 20.
I'm sorry.
So we allowed you twice your time. And so since so many of you, like me, have shared and enjoyed every word he said, I was given the task of actually asking some more questions, okay, to dig deeper into something else. So I'll probably just say two things. Almost everything he said today is in this book. So, you know, if you felt it was an encyclopedia of information that it was overwhelming, it's all there written nicely. Vijay has this habit of speaking like a talking encyclopedia. He speaks like he writes. I think almost everything you said I've read in the book. So I think that's one thing that if you found a lot of great information, it's all here. It's in one place. That's something very nice. But what I will try and do is I will read a couple of passages from the book that interested me and ask him something deeper. Not controversial, but you know, something which is the answer not in the book. So I'll since we are short of time, I've just picked a few passages. But what interested me a lot was the little line on Kempegowda. This flower garden, Hoovenatota, was laid out in 1537 with a view to growing flowers for worshipping in temples. Now, this was the first time I had ever seen in writing that actually traced the antiquity of Lalbagh beyond 1760s, like, as most of us know, to almost 500 years ago with Kempegowda. It's not the common narrative, it's not something I'd heard about. So my question to you is, it's quite a big deal.
It is, of course. I mean,
so how is it that the establishment of a garden at this location by Kempegowda is generally ignored in the narrative and has now come to light? I'm just curious to know what it tells us about us as people, how little we know about our own places, and your take on that.
well, most of the history of Bangalore has been written by the colonial rulers to start with. And you could not have expected colonial rulers to talk about Kempegowda and what he had done at that time, so it's not recorded. And we Indians anyway do not record things. So this is something which is carried on, and we've put bits and pieces together and make up a history which is disjointed, and that's the main problem. And that is why you've not heard of it, neither had I, till I read a publication of the Horticulture Society where this is clearly established. But this changes the whole perspective and it makes sense. I mean, here is Kempegowda, who had been blessed by Guru Nanak to start his new city in what we know of as Bangalore today. He builds a tower on the southern end to show the limits to which he expects Bangalore to grow. Then it only be natural that he would use that land, there was a water body there, to grow flowers for the temples. Temples are important things, a very major institution in those days, And his son, we know this also on record, that is Magdi Kempegowda, continued growing flowers there till 1559. We're talking from 1537 to 1559 now. There's a little gap there because nobody has recorded what's happened. Till Haider comes, And he finds a flower garden, but more than that, a Mavina Topa, a dry, mango orchard, on which he built all of Lalbagh. But the same figures occur for a few centuries, 34 acres, 35 acres, maybe 37 acres, right up to Alan Black, who talks about the garden having expanded to 50 acres, and then Cameron to 120 acres, and to Marigauda to 200 acres of land, and a pertinent lake of 35 acres. And that's the only bit of green in Bangalore which has expanded. And I think largely because every one of those people who helmed Lalbagh, the moment they acquired contiguous land, they broke the walls and rebuilt the wall, so that that wall is something which people would not encroach on. And it worked very, very well. I mean, it started at 34 acres, and now we've got totally with the lake 240 acres,
Thank you. One hopes we find out more about this. So, moving next to Tipu Sultan, who is widely credited with doing a lot of work out there. I'm reading again from your book. Tipu's experiments in botany and horticulture have had a lasting impact in as much as establishing Mysore as a pioneer in horticulture, sericulture, and agro industries. Now, Tipu Sultan was a fighting man.
Yes.
He had to fight to survive. He had to fight to expand. It was an era where nobody rested. They were not, emperors of leisure.
Yes.
He died young, 49.
Yes, true.
How and why did he find the time to invest in all these fields? And I remember you telling me how he brought 22 chests of seeds across the Western Ghats. Huge investment and effort.
Yes.
So my question is, today we struggle to find the time and the effort,
yes,
to do things that are not core to what we think are important. And clearly, so I'm just curious to know, why do you think Tipu Sultan invested so much time doing what he did?
Two things. One, as a Muslim, a garden on earth was a reflection of paradise. This is important to understand the psyche and the thinking of Muslim rulers. The second is, although they were savagely fighting wars, and in those days, you either acquired territory or you lost territory, so you had to keep on fighting. And there was no UN to appeal to. Not that the UN is doing a great job either, but nonetheless, they had to be alert and they had to keep on fighting, acquiring territory. Yet, they were able to change gears very fast mentally. And after a savage war, they would set up, if they had an inclination, beautiful gardens. Sometimes Charbagh and other gardens, like the Malavalli garden. Buchanan notes, right as Tipu died, that there were 2,400 mango and orange trees. That was one of the things started by Haider. But they were extraordinary people, and Tipu particularly, his love for plants, how plants permeated his thinking and his father's, and how he put it into practical application. Like even in the dispensation of justice, for a minor crime, the criminal would be let off if he planted 2 trees and saw them grow to a certain height. If it was a major crime, he had to grow fruiting trees till they bore fruit, and then he was let off. Garlands were, jasmine garlands were placed around the necks of esteemed guests right through from Haider's days. Everywhere plants seem to, sort of be a major thing, dominating their thinking. Then, of course, he started the sericulture industry. Then, of course, Chakotha, which I've just talked about. But he was a driven man. I mean, he went to Turkey, collected figs. Turkey is the home of figs worldwide. That's where it comes from originally. And then that culminated ultimately in Cheluvaiah setting up what is called the fig garden at Ganjam, which is on the outskirts of Srirangapatna. Everything Tipu did seemed to work out very, very well. That was one thing I had not mentioned earlier. Then, of course, I mentioned sericulture, poppies, opium. He was the person who started. He declared pepper and tobacco and sandalwood as plants on which only it, could be dealt with commercially by royalty. That continues till today as far as sandalwood goes. It has not changed. The state owns the sandalwood plant even if it's growing accidentally in your property, you know. So,
Yeah, fascinating.
yeah.
When I talk about Bangalore, we are often asked, why is Bangalore the IT capital, the knowledge hub? And most of the answers go back to the setting up of the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore by the Tatas, who should ideally have set it up in Mumbai. So for a variety of reasons, it was set up here. It's just 100 years old, and you can trace back a lot of Bangalore's today to an institution built 100 years ago.
True.
Lalbagh is an institution, is what I get from what an institution based in Bangalore, where some of the world's leading figures in their fields operated from. Modern botany came to India through Lalbagh.
Yes.
So my question is, where all these people you mentioned, Cleghorn and Munro, they were all spectacular figures
Yes.
who contributed or brought their knowledge into Lalbagh. I'm interested in the reverse. If an institution that is now 250 years old, or maybe 200, what contribution has Bangalore and Lalbagh made to the world of taxonomy and botany by being where it is? And why have we not continued that practice?
Well, in a sense, I answered, this is all bits and pieces, but the identification, the wild ginger was done by Indian taxonomists, 3 of them, which it was unknown to science, that plant, right from when it was painted till 133 years afterwards. So you find bits and pieces like this everywhere because we didn't record things at all. Like, for example, the American, agricultural department wanted 4 fig trees from India. Kempegowda sent out 4 fig trees, which included the Goni Mara, which grows everywhere around Bangalore and very well in Mysore state. In fact, Benjamin Heyne named it Ficus mysorensis, and in books of botany you'll find Heyne in brackets. Now, extraordinary thing is, this also shows you the way we think and the way the Western world thinks. In a place called, it's Palomar College, next to San Diego in America, they produce excellent wine from the figs of the Goni Mara. We have never thought of it in India. And if any of you go to San Diego, go and buy a few bottles of that wine, take pity on me and bring back one for me. But they produce wine and jellies from the fig of the Goni Mara. And Karnataka today has Goni Maras everywhere. Everywhere. You've got a massive one in Lalbagh, which has got a spread of 180 feet. We would, when we talk about Goni Mara, that's the way we think. We would rather go back, I think, to Kalidasa's poem, see if it's mentioned there, incorporate that bit into our body of knowledge. But to investigate it, find out its uses, applications, so on and so forth, we don't do. And lots of the things which have happened have not been recorded at all. Italian cheesemakers, they use a lot of figs of different kinds which are not edible, in the sense they're not tasty, but they use it to flavor cheeses. We have use of only 2 figs. One is the Anjeer, or the, Ficus caraca, and the others in North India, they use the gular or cluster fig. They make curries out of it, or even eat it raw, as it were. But a lot has gone out, lots and lots, and we are not aware of it. I come across things all over the place. There's this gentleman called Fairchild. He's Alexander Graham Bell's grandson-in-law, and he was called the plant collector, and he went all over the world for about 40 years collecting plants. There's this lovely story of how he brought the mango for planting in Florida. He collected a whole lot of mangoes in Bombay and baskets of it. And you've got to go by boat to the ship. And the ship captain said, sorry, we can't take it. There's too much weight. Look at the enterprise of the man. He took these mangoes, went to near the Taj, and asked all the urchins to come and had them eat it all up and give him the seed. And then the weights were correct then. He could have added on more seeds. And then that is how mangoes were introduced into Florida, It's a fascinating...
So this story is not in the book.
This is not in the book.
Yeah, so there's a lot which is not yet in the book. You need a second
because it has to
edition,
do with Bombay and Fairchild. I've not put it in,
Yeah, so I'm going to move on to the next question, just to go to a new topic.
Yes.
I'm reading from the book again. So William Hooker, director of Kew Gardens, considered that the introduction of cinchona plants into India would be remembered as the most important contribution of Kew Gardens to India.
Yes.
Do you agree? And tell us a little more
yes,
about
I do
cinchona,
agree.
because you haven't.
I do agree.
Yeah.
I mean, in the 1860s, malaria was the biggest killer in the world. It probably is even today, apart from what the pandemic is doing, Now, the discovery of the source of malaria, as well as the antidote to malaria, are separated by 20 years. Now, the antidote to malaria was quinine, which came from the cinchona plant. So the British sent out, Mr. Markham, who was a botanist, to Peru to collect cinchona seeds and saplings. And they were found in the Andes. So he brought it to India. It was first planted in Lalbagh and, nurtured there. It came to Tellicherry first, all these plants, then to Lalbagh. Cleghorn got involved. And he knew the places where in Ooty this should be planted. Now the plan was, and brilliantly worked out, that because 10% of the workforce, Indian workforce, was always down with malaria. Plan was to make cinchona bark available to every single Indian through the greatest distribution system the world has known and still knows, that is the Indian Post Office. You have one even in snowbound Lowell and Spiti at 14,500 feet. So the cinchona bark was supplied to all post offices in India and was sold to Indians at cost. You just had to take the bark home, boil it, and drink this bitter, quinine-containing extract which you got from it, tea which had quinine in it. It was a horrible thing, the taste. But the British, being our rulers, had to imbibe their quinine in a superior fashion. So you had gin and tonic water, if you please. Tonic water, by definition, contains quinine, So, and you can imagine the impact, the way it was worked out. I haven't told the whole story, but it was Ronald Ross, who in 1880s and 1890s, he was appointed assistant sanitary garrison engineer in Bangalore to look after the cantonment area medically, so to say, to make sure that no diseases spread. So he cleaned out the wells and what have you. But he had a lot of time in his hands. He'd play tennis in Cubbon Park every afternoon, have all 3 meals in the officers' mess in the MEG Centre. He noticed in the MEG Centre that after having his meals, often the bearers would throw their empty trays on the lawn outside. That would collect rainwater and in turn larvae, and those larvae became mosquitoes. So Ronald Ross was the first person to suspect and to prove that those were the female Anopheles mosquito who carried the malaria vector. To prove it, he did an really funny thing. He got hold of his assistant called Hussein Ali. He put him into a mosquito net, introduced the female Anopheles mosquito, paid Hussein Ali 2 annas per bite of the female Anopheles mosquito. Hussein Ali was, in his bizarre way of thinking, very happy with it because he got a malaria immediately, but he thought that at least he got paid for it. The rest of the population of Bangalore didn't. It's an extraordinary thing when you read the history of this. Then Ronald Ross wrote up his papers, and then he was transferred to Secunderabad cantonment, and he sent his papers to Europe. He was the second person in the world to get, the Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology in 1902 for work done in India and in Bangalore, started in Bangalore. And I thought it would be appropriate for the Prime Minister to go to the Nobel Committee and claim that for India, because Ronald Ross was born in Almoda in India, did his work in India, and the mosquitoes were Indian. But then Arun corrected me. He said, he went and found out the original document. It said Ronald Ross of India. So I
Ronald
started
Ross, the
corrected
citation
that.
says Ronald Ross, India. So
Yeah.
technically, he was
Yeah.
from India.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is in the pandemic time that 100 years ago,
Yeah,
both the pandemic, its cure, the human trials,
yeah.
and the solution were found between Bowring Hospital, Alsur Lake.
True.
So
True.
the connections are immense. And I'm just going to ask my final question, Vijay, because
Yeah.
there are many more and we're short of time. But this
Yeah.
is a question where I want you to dream. It's not in the book.
Right.
And I wanted to understand what is your vision for Lalbagh, your dream, or to put it more differently, if in the audience, and we may have them, you have the government, you have philanthropists, you have someone who can do something, what is your wish list for what this institution should become?
I would start with Lalbagh's strengths as a botanic garden. And they're not mutually exclusive, a park and a botanic garden. Like Hyde Park was started as a botanic garden, not Hyde Park, Kew Gardens, only in 1760. 1759 by the Earl of Bute and Princess Augusta, who introduced exotic plants. Till then, it was a royal retreat. Just like Lalbagh, very similar, and the dates are also quite similar. 1760 was when Haider Wali started this. With that, there are so many things which I would build upon. Captain Prabhala is a great advocate of. He insists that this knowledge must be disseminated, must be a cross-fertilization. Every 2 weeks, there must be a lecture on botany and the plant sciences out of Lalbagh. Then there must be an interaction between the botanists of Kew Gardens and other gardens worldwide with the botanists of Lalbagh. I insist, and I think that's the right way to go about it, because in the papers I'm constantly reading about new species of plants and frogs and what have you being found in the Western Ghats. Lalbagh should generate plant collecting expeditions into the Western Ghats. 239 species of orchids are in the Western Ghats, out of which 139 are endemic to what is Karnataka part of Western Ghats. You can't separate them. So there should be a huge orchidarium, because it's at the same heights that the orchids grow in the Western Ghats. And India is one of the great places for orchids, And we should have an orchidarium in Lalbagh. And last year, in fact, they did have an exhibition of orchids during the Republic Day function. And the plant collecting expedition, there should be a museum. There should be a museum of the different woods of the different trees in South India and things like that in the exhibitions, so that the general public must be educated, and they must be, how to put it, I don't have the correct, but they must be encouraged to look at the environment, study the trees, understand what our environment consists of. Is that the
Yeah,
last thing?
let's hope it happens.
No,
And I think,
there's so many other things I can add on, but just with this as a start, I think you could, Lalbagh would be a wonderful place. It must become an international center ultimately for, botanical sciences. Today, there is a lot of work, research work being done in botany, in A3, GK, VK, NCBS, so on and so forth. But what you have in Lalbagh is something unique. It's a park, it's a botanic garden. What we need to do is what I saw. Of course, they're a little patronizing. What I saw in a botanic garden somewhere in the West, there was a herbarium of this botanic garden, which is just half the size of Lalbagh. The herbarium has 1.6 million different species of plants. And I saw a little girl run into the herbarium with a plant in her hands, just the roots sticking out, no soil. And the young men there were preparing these charts and pinning down the plants. They came around to her and asked her what was she doing there with that plant. So she said, how my mother is, she's completely useless. I found this plant in our house. She said, go to the Botanic Garden, they'll tell you what it is. So I'm here. So they couldn't identify the plant. Then she picked up courage to say, call the boss man down. He might know. So he came down. He had a look at it also. He said, I don't know this plant, but you've got to do me 3 favors, young lady. So then she quietened up. She didn't know what was going on. He said, I will put up this plant on our website. and it'll go all around the world, and there'll be a number of botanists who will be able to identify it. I'll take out photographs of the roots and stem and leaves and everything. Then the second favor you've got to do for me is let me put this plant in a pot, which I'll return to you. And the third favor was after they've identified the plant, they were going to have a public lecture on the plant. And who is going to be the chief guest invited by the director of the herbarium? This young girl. And then he tells her charmingly, it's your choice if you want to invite your mother or not. But look at this. There's this young girl, completely lost. Her mother's not helping her. And suddenly she would, just this little incident will make sure she's interested in botany all her life, even if she doesn't make it a profession. We need this kind of thing because we've got such incredible wealth, not only in Lalbagh, but everywhere around. I'll end with that.
So I think on that note, we are behind time, but I think we can ask.
Continue the conversation informally.
Yeah, so I think unfortunately the audience will not get time to ask questions, but I think Vijay will be able to on stage to talk after that.
So we'd like to thank Vijay Thiruvady and Arun Pai. As you can see, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. We've had this wonderful panoramic, magisterial view of the history of Lalbagh, but also all the connections to many distant continents through this luminous botanical world that seems to lift all of our spirits. Before we conclude, there are a few people here whose presence we would like to acknowledge. Captain Prabhala, who was closely connected to the writing and production of the book. He was formerly the head of the Bangalore Environment Trust, and he's here. I'd like to mention the grandchildren of Mr. Javraya, Harish Padmanabha and Sharmila Gowda, who are here. And of course, Lily Dechamma, Vijay's assistant, who has been operating the slides and who's done incredible work through the whole pandemic and with today's lecture. And I should also mention that on Monday, November 29th, that is, at 6:30, day after, we are screening a film on Krumbigel called The Maharaja's German Gardener. And Vijay has also been interviewed for that film. So we hope to see you at that event. And thank you all for coming this evening. This is probably one of the largest audiences we have had for a lecture since the pandemic, which is very encouraging to us and a tribute to Vijay's extraordinary work and the many people that he has touched. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm humbled. I just want to mention here that our chairman, Dr. Yellappa Reddy, is tied up in another function which he was committed to over a month ago at Cheluvaiah Institute of Oncology. So he couldn't make it. Otherwise, we would have had him here also as part of the panel. Right.